when the divorce happened, it was an incredible loss to me. Yeah. Stop believing. Hold on to that. It is calling on you. We're still here.
He was the man with the voice of an angel, a voice that could lift a crowd of 50,000 to their feet or make the whole world cry in silence. But behind that gift was something most people never knew. Before the fame, before the sold-out shows, before Journey became a household name, Steve Perry was just a boy standing in an empty room, listening to his father's voice fade down the hallway, one final time. He never forgot the sound of the door closing. That was the day his childhood ended. And though Steve rarely spoke about it in public, that single moment shaped everything: his music, his loneliness, his desire for perfection, and his silence. Because when his father left, something inside Steve went with him. For years he carried that emptiness like a secret melody, one that would later echo in songs like Open Arms. Faithfully. And Foolish Heart. Songs that weren't just about love, but about loss. Decades later, long after his voice had conquered the world, stories began to circulate that Steve had written a letter he never mailed. No one knew what it said. Some said it was a goodbye, others believed it was a confession, words he could never say out loud to the man who shaped and scarred him all at once. Was it real? No one knows for sure, but the deeper you look into Steve Perry's life, the clearer it becomes. There was always someone missing in every song he wrote. The question isn't whether Steve Perry forgave his father, the question is whether he ever could, and maybe that's why the letter was never sent. You're watching RetroWaves, the channel where the biggest legends in music reveal the stories they never told. If you love uncovering the hidden truths behind songs that changed the world, then this is where you belong. Every week we dive deep into the heartbreak, the mystery, and the moments that shaped the voices of a generation. So if you believe music means more than just sound, hit subscribe, turn on the bell, and join us on this journey through the untold stories of the past. Because on RetroWaves, every note carries a secret, and every silence has something to say. Long before Journey ruled the radio, before millions of fans screamed his name, Steve Perry lived in a small California town that most people have never heard of, Hanford. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and dreams were supposed to stay small. Steve was born in 1949 to Ray Perry, a professional singer and drummer, and Mary Quaresma, a warm-hearted Portuguese-American woman who adored her son. Ray was talented, gifted, even performing in dance halls and clubs, but life on the road was hard, and money was always tight. And as happens in so many musical families, the music started to pull them apart. When Steve was still a child, his parents separated. He stayed with his mother, who raised him mostly on her own. Ray, his father, drifted away. Steve would later say very little about it, not out of anger, but because it hurt too much to talk about. His mother became his protector, his guide, and the one who told him to never give up. But she also carried bitterness. She would remind him that his father had the same musical gift, warning him quietly, "Don't make the same mistakes." That warning stayed with Steve forever, because the truth was, he couldn't escape his father, not in his features, not in his voice, and not in his passion for music. It was as though Ray had passed on a part of himself that Steve could never return. Friends who knew him in those early years said that Steve was different. He was quiet, serious, and obsessed with sound. He spent hours listening to the radio, trying to copy the voices of his idols, Sam Cooke, Jackie Wilson, Marvin Gaye. Music wasn't a hobby, it was therapy. It was how he talked to someone who wasn't there to answer, and for a long time it worked, until it didn't. When Steve reached his teenage years, he began to feel a pull, a desire to find his place, to prove that the voice inside him meant something. He joined local bands, sang at school dances, and wrote songs that no one else heard. But behind every melody, there was that same question. Would his father have been proud of him, or would he have walked away again? As Steve grew older, the distance between them became permanent. There were no interviews, no photographs, no stories of reconciliation, just silence. And yet that silence became the engine behind one of the greatest rock voices the world would ever hear. Because when Steve sang, it wasn't just performance, It was confession. Every lyric was a message, every high note a cry for the person who left too soon. Many people later wondered why Steve Perry's songs carried so much emotion, why even at his happiest there was always sadness underneath. The answer was simple: his voice was born from loss. But before he could ever make peace with his past, fate would hand him something he never expected: the chance to rise, to become a legend, and to finally face the shadow of the man who gave him that voice in the first place. After his father walked away, the Perry home changed overnight. The laughter faded first, then the music. Mary did her best to keep her son's world steady, but she saw the difference. Steve stopped asking where his father had gone. Instead, he listened to the hum of the radio, to the wind through the orange groves outside their window, to the emptiness that seemed to echo louder every year. He was barely old enough to understand loss, but he understood sound. He started singing because it was the only thing that answered back. When he tried to imitate Sam Cooke, he wasn't chasing fame. He was trying to replace silence. He practiced in garages, in the fields behind his house, anywhere the echoes could make him feel less alone. He didn't have a father to guide him, so he let the records become his teachers. Mary supported him with everything she had. She saved money for his first microphone, took him to small-town shows, and told him that his voice was a gift. But she also carried a quiet fear. She knew that the same passion that made her husband leave the family might pull her son away one day too. People in Hanford said Steve was unusually driven, always chasing perfection, always rehearsing, but that drive came from somewhere deeper. Every note he hit felt like a message across time, a question sent to a man who might never answer. When classmates talked about their dads, Steve stayed quiet. He'd smile, then walk away. Instead of joining their games, he'd go back to his room and play his tape recorder, layering his own voice until it sounded like a choir of one. By the time he was a teenager, his voice had matured, smooth, powerful, and heartbreakingly emotional. It could rise and break all in one breath, as if grief itself had learned to sing. He didn't know it then, but that sound, born from loneliness, would one day carry him farther than he could imagine. And somewhere out there, the man who gave him his name was still singing too, unaware that his son's voice was becoming legendary. When Steve Perry joined Journey in 1977, everything changed almost overnight. The band had been searching for an identity, someone who could turn their musicianship into magic. Then came the voice, warm, soulful, impossible to ignore. From the first time he stepped onto the stage, audiences felt something electric. Here was a man who sang not just with talent, but with pain. His voice had that ache, the kind that comes from loving and losing before you're old enough to understand either. The world saw confidence, but behind the microphone, Steve still carried the same invisible wound. He would later admit that performing filled a hole in him, but it never healed it. Fame became his distraction, and sometimes his disguise. By 1981, Journey was untouchable. Albums like Escape and Frontiers topped the charts, and Don't Stop Believin' became an anthem across generations.
Don't stop believing.
Every lyric felt like it had come from a heart that had lived through more than its share of goodbyes. Yet success didn't bring peace. Steve's bandmates noticed he was often quiet after shows, sitting alone even while the crowd outside was chanting his name. He smiled for fans, but inside he still wrestled with the same question that haunted his childhood. Would his father ever hear him sing? There were whispers through the years that Ray Perry tried to reach out once his son became famous. Some said he wrote to him, others claimed he came to one of Steve's concerts and watched from the back of the arena. None of those stories have ever been confirmed. If they were true, Steve never mentioned them. What we do know from interviews and friends who were close to him is that Steve rarely spoke of his father at all. He poured those feelings into the music instead. Songs like Open Arms and Faithfully weren't just romantic ballads, they were letters disguised as melodies.
They say that the road ain't no place to stop.
Fans around the world sang along without realizing that they were echoing a son's unanswered words. As Journey conquered charts, tours, and awards, Steve's silence off stage grew louder. He had everything the world could offer: success, admiration, a voice that defined an era, and yet the one person he most wanted to share it with was still out of reach. It's said that when applause fades, the truth gets louder, and for Steve Perry, that truth was simple: you can fill an arena with sound, and still be haunted by the silence of one man's absence. By the mid-1980s, Journey had reached a level few bands ever touched. Every concert was sold out, every album went platinum, but something inside Steve Perry had started to break. He wasn't sleeping much. He'd started feeling trapped, not by the music, but by the constant noise around him. The tours, the pressure, the expectation to always sound perfect. And deep down, he began to feel like he was losing the very thing that once gave him peace. For years he had used his voice to drown out his childhood pain. Now even that wasn't enough. He wanted silence, not applause. Friends from that era remember how he began pulling away. After shows, he'd disappear into his dressing room, saying little to anyone. Some of his bandmates thought he was just tired. Others worried he was drifting into something darker. There are verified accounts that Steve's mother, Mary, became ill around this time, and her illness hit him hard. She was the one constant in his life, the only person who'd never left. When she passed away in 1987, it shattered him. People close to Steve said her death was the moment he truly stopped running. The walls he'd built to protect himself crumbled. He had faced loss before, but this time, there was no stage to escape to. After that, Steve's connection to Journey began to unravel. He tried to keep going, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt burned out, emotionally and spiritually. In 1988, he left the band at the height of their success. No public fights, no explosive ending, just a quiet exit, the kind that spoke volumes. Many fans never understood why, but those who looked closer could see it. The grief, the loneliness, the exhaustion of carrying decades of silence. Some believed that walking away from music was Steve's way of finding himself again. Others said he was still trying to find peace with the ghosts that followed him since childhood, and somewhere in that silence, the story of the letter began to take shape. A letter he wrote, maybe after his mother's death, maybe long before, to the man he could never forgive. No one ever saw it. No one knows if it was real, but its existence became one of the most whispered rumors among Journey fans. A letter never sent, from a son to a father who never came home. Rumor has it that during the late 1980s, while Steve was away from the spotlight, he began writing letters he never mailed. Some were to friends, some to the band he left behind, and one, it said, was to his father. None of this has ever been confirmed by Steve himself. He's never publicly spoken about such a letter, but the story persists because it fits the pattern of his life, a man who expressed what he felt through words no one ever heard. Those who knew him during that time describe a person deeply reflective, even haunted. He spent long nights alone, writing in notebooks, listening to old demos, and talking about forgiveness, not forgiveness for others, but for himself. The letter, according to those rumors, was not angry. It wasn't even meant to blame. It was more like a confession, the words of a son who finally understood why people leave. If that letter truly existed, it may have been written in the years when Steve began rediscovering music on his own terms. In 1994, he released his solo album, For the Love of Strange Medicine, which carried a different energy, softer, more introspective. Songs like Anyway, and It's Only Love sounded like they came from someone looking back, not forward. Many fans and critics heard something in those lyrics, the struggle to forgive, to move on, to let go of what was lost. In one interview around that time, Steve said something that fans never forgot. He said, "Sometimes forgiveness isn't about the other person, it's about freeing yourself." It was one of the few moments he seemed to touch that hidden part of his past. Whether or not the letter existed, those words said enough. It's possible, though never confirmed, that Steve reconciled privately with his father before Ray's passing. There are no public records of such a meeting, but some reports suggest they might have spoken again later in life. If they did, it was never for the cameras. Steve has always guarded his personal life like a sacred thing, and maybe that's because forgiveness for him was never about grand gestures or perfect endings. It was about finding peace in imperfection, learning to live with questions that would never have answers. For Steve Perry, the letter might not have needed to be sent, it only needed to be written. After years of retreat, Steve Perry disappeared from public life. For almost a decade, he lived away from the stage. No tours, no interviews, no spotlight. Fans wondered what had happened to him. Some said he'd lost his passion. Others whispered that he'd lost his voice, but the truth was quieter and more human than anyone imagined. In those silent years, Steve faced himself. Without the noise of fame, without the expectations, he finally began to understand what his life had been running from. He once described those years as necessary. He said, "Sometimes you have to stop singing to hear what your heart has been trying to say." During that time, his father, Ray Perry, was still alive. There were unverified reports that they may have exchanged words, possibly even reconciled. But again, nothing has ever been confirmed by Steve himself. He has never spoken publicly about any final meeting, and perhaps that's because the details were too personal, too sacred. What we do know is this: in interviews after his return to music, Steve spoke often about forgiveness, pain, and the passage of time. He talked about how he had learned that holding on to anger only deepens the wound. He said, "You can't change the past, but you can make peace with it." Those who heard him talk about his father noticed something different in his tone, not bitterness, not regret, but calm acceptance. It was as if he had finally laid that chapter to rest, not with revenge, but with understanding. In 1998, Journey was inducted into the Hollywood Walk of Fame. When the band reunited briefly for that ceremony, Steve appeared smiling, gentle, at peace. He thanked the fans, the band, and his family, but never mentioned his father. Still, in the way he spoke, you could hear it, the unspoken message of a man who had finally stopped running. Years later, in 2011, Steve met a woman named Kelly Nash, a psychologist and cancer survivor. He said she changed his life. For the first time in decades, he let himself love openly, but tragedy struck again. Kelly's cancer returned, and she passed away in 2012. That loss reopened every wound he had buried, but this time Steve didn't hide from it. He said Kelly taught him something before she died, that love is always worth the pain. And maybe, just maybe, that was the final lesson he needed to forgive everything that came before. In the years since, Steve Perry has lived quietly, occasionally stepping back into the light. His return to music in 2018 with the album Traces was more than a comeback. It was a letter to life itself. That album wasn't filled with stadium anthems. It was full of quiet reflections, songs about memory, time, and healing. Tracks like No Erison,
How could I forget? No erasing.
and We're Still Here carried the voice of a man who had finally found peace with his past.
We're still here, with shadows falling.
When asked what inspired the record, Steve said something simple but powerful: "These songs are my emotional truth." He never mentioned the letter, he never spoke directly about his father. But the tone of the album, the way he sang, the tenderness in every word, said what the letter might have said all along: "I forgive you, and I forgive myself." In many ways, that unsent letter became a symbol of Steve Perry's life. It represented the words he could never say, the love he could never express, and the peace he eventually found in silence. There are still rumors that Steve keeps that letter, folded and hidden among his things, a reminder of where he came from. Again, this has never been confirmed. But whether or not it exists, the truth is that he no longer needs it, because sometimes forgiveness doesn't live on paper, it lives in how you move forward. Steve Perry's voice, once filled with longing, now carries something softer, not pain, not anger, but grace. He once said, "Love doesn't leave you, it stays, even when people go." And maybe that's why he never sent the letter, because deep down the message had already been received. For decades, Steve Perry's songs told stories of love, heartbreak, and hope, but behind them all was one silent conversation between a father and a son who spoke only through music. If this story moved you, subscribe to RetroWaves, where every voice has a hidden story and every legend leaves behind a truth worth hearing. What do you think was written in that letter Steve never sent? Let us know in the comments. And stay tuned, because next time we'll uncover another untold story from the heart of rock and roll. On RetroWaves, the music never fades, it remembers.